Hi everyone, Newthany Utano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of the latest record from Blood Orange, Freetown Sound. This is the latest full-length LP from producer, multi-instrumentalist, singer-songwriter Devonte Hines, who has been at it for a long time now. I remember listening to one of his earliest groups, Test Icicles, back in my college days, which was a pretty interesting dance punk, synth punk group. Then he would move on to do some indie rock and pop under the Lightspeed Champion name, and now in his latest incarnation, Blood Orange, not only has he been making music that is very different from indie rock and pop, but he's also been expanding his talents as a songwriter and a producer, lending his talents to make other people sound better, working with artists like FKA Twigs and Florence and the Machine, and my favorite recently, Carly Rae Jepsen on her latest full-length LP. But when he's putting out music for himself, he's dropping these dreamy reincarnations of pop, R&B, and synth funk from the 80s. And thus far he's been doing it pretty successfully with two very popular albums under his belt and now a new one. Now his last record, Cupid Deluxe, personally did not care for this album at all. I thought this thing was instrumentally hollow, it was emotionally bland, everything was just a little too washed out in reverb effects. He seemed to have a strong grasp of the nostalgia that was fueling his desire to make this music, but there wasn't a lot in terms of compelling songwriting. But it's been a while since that album dropped, and as far as I can tell, Devonte has been progressing quite a bit as a songwriter working with other artists, so maybe this new record over here will be more detailed and mature and interesting. And we do get a pretty different Blood Orange this time around. This new project over here is a longer project, standing at 59 minutes with 17 tracks, and overall this project is more instrumentally adventurous than anything Blood Orange has dropped in the past. I love the hand percussion and the very groovy bass guitar on the song Juicy 1-4. Also the gorgeous vocal harmonies and jazzy horn embellishments that kick the record off I think are fantastic, even if the second half of the song is dominated by feminist slam poetry. I also love the weird, melty, horrifying string sections on the song E.V.P. They pair weirdly, but also nicely with the very awesome bass and drum grooves, and there's a great drum solo on the track too. I also like the funky horn sections against the very chill synthetic instrumentation on the song Love Ya. And also, there are loads of notable vocal guest appearances on this thing. People like Debbie Harry and Zuri Marley, Nelly Furtado, and Carly Rae Jepsen. And a lot of these guest appearances develop into these very steamy, dreamy, nocturnal, sensual duets that are pretty nice. And there's also a variety of sound clips littered throughout this record too that transition one song to another song or sort of interrupt in the middle of a track that I think insert some kind of political message into some of these tracks. It doesn't always work, but I admire the fact that, again, Devonte is being way more sonically adventurous with this new project. It's the 80s pastiche that this project has been known for up until this point, but with much more bulk to it. Now the vocals are still a little more washed out than I would like them to be, especially on tracks like Augustine, and I do think the overuse of reverb does tend to suck some of the characteristics out of the vocals, especially when it comes to the vocal guests on this record. I think with the heavy use of reverb on these vocals, a lot of them tend to melt together, and if I didn't read into who was who, I would have a hard time telling which guests were what. But the unorthodox use of effects and some of the odd mixing practices on this record, as well as Devonte's vocals, do give this album kind of an amateurish charm. You know, if you like people who make lo-fi, weird throwback pop music like Ariel Pink or guys like Dame Funk, I think you're gonna hear some interesting stuff on this project. Now, despite me thinking that Blood Orange has greatly improved from the last record, I still think this album has its lackluster moments, or just spots where the songwriting is a little subpar, namely on cuts like Desiree, which is mostly padded out with these vocal snippets that don't necessarily add that much to the tune, or like the painfully corny lyrics on the song Love Ya, a song that, to me in terms of momentum, never really gets going. It seems kind of like an endless intro of sorts. Or the song Squash Squash, which is kind of like a single refrain extended out to 3 minutes and 30 seconds with a few groovy instrumental breaks. And the song Hands Up, a track that I like in terms of melody and its groove and its structure, but as I dive deeper into the song, it seems like this really awkward marriage of an attempt at making a political statement about police brutality and racism, and like a love song. And then we have the song But You, which features these incredibly nasally lead vocals where Devante is just trying to do his best at a Michael Jackson impersonation, which in a way reminds me of back in the day when Eddie Murphy would drop tracks that would clearly be pulling from the king of pop, or Corey Feldman. It just seems like a track that if it had come out in the 80s and people were talking about it today, it would be sort of funny because we would look back on it as like, oh look, another guy trying to be MJ, but instead it's coming out in 2016, it's new. Not to mention the incredibly corny hook on this track. You are special in your own way. You know, there's some cuts on here that have some solid songwriting and muscular grooves, and these are my favorite moments. E.V.P, the song Juicy with its sharp slap bass line, and the song Hadron Collider is a pretty good ballad too. The beautiful pianos on the song I Know are pretty nice. I enjoyed Carly Rae Jepsen's appearance on the album too. There are a lot of good ideas on this record, but they're not always backed up with good songs. Some of the production leaves a little to be desired, especially when, despite the fact that it seems like there's so much more instrumental detail in this project, the sound is still a little hollow due to that reverb. Also, the vocal snippets and clips that don't really add that much to the music or the kind of sexy, funky vibe that this music conveys. I can't ignore that Blood Orange has displayed improvements on this record, and I overall like the mood of the album, and I like that the mood is pretty consistent from track to track, and there are a handful of songs on this record that I like, unlike the previous efforts from Blood Orange, but I still think there's a little bit to go before this project really wows me. Still, it's decent, and I certainly see the hype behind this record, and if you are looking for something with a synth funk, with an 80s pop, with an old school R&B vibe to it, I could see you getting down to this, especially since Devante channels those influences really well into a finely crafted aesthetic. Just don't be surprised if you don't find his songwriting to be as sharp and as groundbreaking and as memorable as the greats such as Prince, who clearly influence him. I'm feeling a decent to strong 6 on this project. Transition. Have you given this album a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best. You're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like. If you like, please subscribe. Please don't cry if you disagree with this review, which most likely you do. Blood Orange. Freetown Sound forever.